Welcome back to TLDR News on the week of Halloween. For the more politically inclined viewer, you may remember that Halloween was meant to be a super important date for Brexit, the do or die date as our Prime Minister once called it. However, in the end an extension was requested by a reluctant Boris Johnson, and the EU granted the request, meaning that the UK is now set to leave before January 31st. It also means that there's now time for a general election to be held before the UK officially leaves the EU. And that's where this video comes in. MPs spent the last 2 days debating the prospects of a new general election. Since kicking out 21 Conservative MPs from his party, Johnson has had a working majority of -43. This makes it very difficult for him to pass any legislation, as we've seen in recent weeks. His proposed solution to this is to hold a general election. So, in this video, we're going to discuss why Johnson wants an election, the arguments that took place in the House of Commons, and ultimately, how MPs decided to vote on this issue. Before we start, I want to give a quick shout out to the Too Long Didn't Read podcast. The podcast team recorded a new episode in reaction to the general election result, and discussed some of the other things that have happened in UK politics recently, and that episode will be available later today. You can also find a link to the regular podcast feed down below, where you can listen to our full episode about the general election once it's released later today. You can subscribe to the podcast on all of your favourite podcast services, so click the link in the description to get all of the links you need. Prior to 2011, this would have all been very simple. Johnson could have set a date for an election, and that's that. However, for those of you who haven't noticed, we're no longer in pre-2011 Britain, and Johnson instead has to contend with something called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. This means that instead of just calling an election, having it done with, if he wants an earlier election, he needs to secure support from at least 2/3 of the House of Commons. Something which he clearly can't do with Conservative votes alone. In fact, he can't even do it with the Conservatives, ex-Conservatives, those removed from the party, and the DUP all combined together. Instead, he must secure the backing of opposition parties. And this is where the problem lies. Johnson was gunning for a 12th of December election. The Liberal Democrats and the SNP claim that they instead wanted a 9th of December election. The obvious question to be asked here is why? Isn't that literally only 3 days? What's the point? The point, according to the SNP and the Liberal Democrats, is that they believe that the Prime Minister will try and ram through his Brexit deal. By calling the election earlier, they give Johnson less time before the election to do this. This obviously stops Johnson from ramming his deal through without proper scrutiny, but it's also to the Lib Dems and SNP's advantage. Both of them benefit from a pre-Brexit election, because the SNP can capitalise on the Remainer vote in Scotland, and the Lib Dems can still campaign on a revoke platform. Once a Brexit deal has passed, revoke doesn't make much sense as a policy, and the SNP are worried that Scottish Remainers who have moved to the SNP from the Conservatives might just return back to the Conservative Party once Brexit's all over. It's also because most universities break up on December 13th, so students who are typically pretty Remainery are more likely to still be at their voter-registered term-time addresses on the 9th. However, the SNP and Lib Dems only have a combined 54 seats in Parliament, so even if Johnson could somehow convince them to back his December 12th election, he wouldn't have enough MPs, unless a whole load of rebel Labour MPs decided to back it. Remember, according to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, he needed 2/3 of all MPs to back his motion. That meant that realistically, he needed Labour support if he stood a chance of getting his election through via the Fixed Term Parliament Act. This initially looked unlikely. Labour said they won't back an election until no deal is taken off the table completely. And if we're being cynical, it might have something to do with the fact that Labour are currently polling some 15 points behind the Conservatives at the moment, so it will make little sense for them to back Johnson's call for an election.
Order. Under the standing order, I must now put the question. The question is that there shall be an early parliamentary general election. Division! Clear the lobby. Order.
The ayes to the right, 299. The noes to the left, 70.
Ayes have it, but the motion has not obtained the majority required under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Order. I'm coming to the right, honourable gentleman. Because the majority has not been reached, the noes have it. Point of order, the Prime Minister.
The Leader of the Opposition, literally and figuratively, has run away from the judgment of the people. And I think, frankly, that the electorate will find his behaviour utterly bewildering. But as I said when moving the motion, we will not allow this paralysis to continue. And one way or another, we must proceed straight to an election.
So, as we expected, Johnson's first attempt to get an election was defeated in the Commons by 299 votes to 70, falling far short from the 434 supporters that the vote required. This was largely due to Labour abstaining from the vote altogether. However, this wasn't the end of the drama. The Lib Dems and SNP proposed a one-page bill that would amend the Fixed Term Parliament Act to allow for an election on December 9th. Essentially, the bill overrides the procedures set out in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, stating a date for an election, notwithstanding the FTPA. This is a really important move. Because this is a standard bill, it's not subject to the supermajority rules of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, meaning that it only requires a simple 50% majority in the House of Commons in order for it to pass. That means that unlike their previous motion that required a 2/3 majority, Labour support is no longer required. Because of that, Johnson announced that he'd introduce a nearly identical bill to the Commons on the following day.
So later on this evening, the government will give notice of presentation for a short bill for an election on the 12th of December so that we can finally get Brexit done.
Now you might be wondering why he didn't just do this in the first place. Why did he try and get a 2/3 majority when he could have done it with a simple majority? Well, it's all to do with amendments. The original motion calling for a general election couldn't be amended by MPs. But this new one-page bill can be amended like all other legislation passing through the House. This means that MPs could amend the bill, potentially changing the date of the vote, or even allowing 16-year-olds to vote. Going into the debate, the government seemed open to a slightly earlier date, but not to extending the vote to younger people, saying that doing so would be administratively impossible to deliver in the time available. However, with the Lib Dems and SNP now seemingly on side, Johnson hoped that the one-page bill could get through the House of Commons relatively unscathed. That being said, a large number of amendments were put forward on Tuesday night. These amendments fell into 4 broad categories: changing the date of the election, giving voting rights to 16-year-olds and EU citizens living in the UK, as well as introducing a second referendum. However, the Deputy Speaker didn't bring forward all of these amendments, selecting only one amendment, attempting to move the date to the 9th of December. The others likely weren't selected because they were huge changes to how the UK votes, attached to a rushed bill intended to only affect this election. Once the amendments were selected, the bill was passed through its second reading, before heading to the committee stage where MPs debated the bill. To signify the House was in committee stage, the Speaker left the chair to be replaced by Deputy Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle, and the ceremonial mace was moved to its lower position. So, in committee stage, they had the chance to debate and vote on the amendment, which would change the date of the election to the 9th.
Order! Get at it! Order!
The ayes to the right, 295. The noes to the left, 315.
As you saw, the amendment failed, which meant that the bill made it to the final stage unamended. So the mace was raised back up, and after some confusion, Bercow returned to the chair, and MPs got the chance to finally approve the election. When it came to the actual vote, things were a little less tense than the first time round. Remember earlier in the video I said that Labour wouldn't support the deal? Well, it looks like they changed their mind on that, because on Thursday morning, Jeremy Corbyn announced that the Labour Party would be supporting this bill. Corbyn commented that I have consistently said that we are ready for an election and our support is subject to a no-deal Brexit being off the table. We have now heard from the EU that the extension to Article 50 to 31st of January has been confirmed. So for the next 3 months, our condition of taking no deal off the table has now been met.
Order!
The ayes to the right, 438. The noes to the left, 20.
So the ayes have it, unlock!
As we expected, the vote went in favour of the government, with a majority of MPs supporting the bill. This means that an election has now officially been called, and the process of campaigning is about to begin. The campaign period is set to begin next week, so don't worry, we'll be covering all of that in detail for you. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for all of the latest updates on the election campaign as it plays out. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, the episode of the podcast where we react in full to this announcement will be out later today via the link in the description. So make sure to subscribe to the podcast feed now. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want more from us, you can find TLDR across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then you can sign up to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.